Uh, so Dr. Neelanjana, it's already 2 o'clock, so I will request you to take over the session as the host now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chakravarti. Good afternoon. I welcome you all to the post-lunch session of the conference. Our speaker for this session is Dr. Deepti Ganapathy, and I have the pleasure of introducing her. Dr. Deepti Ganapathy is a faculty of communication at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. She is a Rotary Group Study Exchange Fellow, CNN Young Journalist Finalist, Creative Writing Awardee by the Royal Commonwealth Society, London, and has been recognized by the International Journalists Network as Journalist of the Month. She holds a PhD from the Department of Studies in Communication and Journalism, University of Mysore, and was a visiting fellow at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Ganapathy has over 16 years of practitioner and academic experience with India's leading media and education conglomerates. These include the Times Group, Deccan Herald, NDTV, IIM Indore, and the School of Business Management, NMIMS University. She is the recipient of the Excellence in Teaching Award at NMIMS University. Moreover, she has conducted executive educational programs for HPCL, L&T, the Mahatma Gandhi National Fellowship for the MSDE, and even for senior IAS, IPS, and IES officers working for the Government of India. Recently, she has published a book titled Media and Climate Change, Making Sense of Press Narratives, which I believe will be central to her talk today. She will be talking to us today about mapping climate change through press narratives. I warmly welcome Dr. Ganapathy to the conference and request her to take over.
Thank you so much to the organizers for organizing a very relevant and interesting theme for this conference. And let me just begin by sharing my screen and asking all of you if you can view my screen and hear me well.
Yes, Dr. Ganapathy.
Yes, we can see.
So we're starting around 2:05 and I have about 40 minutes or so. So I'll quickly take you through my, as Neelanjana rightly said, I'm going to focus most of my today's presentation based on my book and its research, which was conducted over 5 years, mapping how the mainstream media in this situation to Indian broadsheet dailies, the Times of India and Deccan Herald, how they covered the media perspective of climate change. And I look at this perspective through, I call it a macrocosm, because I believe if we look at the study through this macrocosm, we can also extrapolate it and look at how biodiversity and environmental crisis is covered everywhere else in the world, because the region that, or the specific area that I chose to look at how the media covers this issue of climate change is in the Western Ghats. And the Western Ghats is, you can call it the rainforest of India. It runs through the entire Western Peninsula of India, through several states. It talks about also the need for us to preserve the biodiversity there, the rich biodiversity. And we also have the multi-dimensional problems such as the presence of indigenous tribes there, that they depend on the forest and its produce. And with this UNESCO World Heritage Tag site that was given to the Western Ghats, how it meant that the ecological sensitive area could no longer have these indigenous communities going into the forests and picking out the produce, which they have been doing in the form of sustainable livelihoods, which we project today as, okay, we want to have sustainable business practices, sustainable livelihoods. But these people who lived in those communities inside the forest were following these sustainable livelihoods for a long, long time. It also looks at the a conundrum that one faces when one talks about developing, the infrastructure in a country like ours, building roads, building rail networks, building hydropower projects, all this cutting through that rich biodiversity region, and how not doing so would mean taking us back several centuries. So all these things really are looked at, and that's why I call it the macrocosm, of looking at how really this pans out. And so when we look at how diversity is covered, and how the media has traditionally looked at this aspect of covering climate change, then we look at this image that is in front of you, which is the polar bear. The polar bear in the distant Arctic region was covered or splashed across the National Geographic, was splashed across the Time magazine with these headlines, which really talked about global warming, the ice caps melting, and that kind of, was the way in which the media chose to project an image by and large of what they believed to be climate change and what they believed to be, the reason why we should be talking about it, right? So can you still see my screen, or you can see my notes?
We can see your screen, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes,
so, yeah, the polar bear, right? The image of the polar bear. So the polar bear standing on this last sheet of ice in the distant North Pole, along with these headlines, be very worried, splashed on the 3rd April 2006 cover of the Time magazine. And the polar bear, in all its pure white and noble appearance, was appealing to the inhabitants of the entire planet, right? We all looked at it standing there forlornly within its habitat, feeling endangered and with no other place to migrate to. Right? Today, that image is reflecting back upon us. We are standing on planet Earth and we are looking at our surroundings and we wonder where else can we migrate to, right? So that the context of that is stark, because we thought that it was limited to the polar bear and it's not going to happen to us. But today, we are standing at a space where everyone is understanding the implications of the climate crisis and is no longer in a space of climate denial, right? And so these subtle messages screamed loud through this frame. And around this frame, the impact of climate change was meant to be conveyed to the world, and the critical role of the centrality that mainstream media or newspapers and magazines played in the understanding of climate change can be interpreted, therefore, in 3 distinct layers. And that's what I start my argument with as well, that first, it was meant to highlight the role played by governments in combating the problem collectively. Second, it directed attention towards susceptible regions, flora and fauna, as well as indigenous communities that were most affected by the ravages of climate change. And third, the projection of people who were emerging as green warriors, championing for the cause of the environment through their activism and through the solutions that they offered on the field. So you can see that, really the scholarship for how the media started setting the agenda and talking about the public discourses was the reason how this coinage of the term agenda setting came into place. And if we look at when we talk about the scholarship on news coverage of climate change, it has largely focused on the United States and Western Europe, and that climate skepticism is predominantly the narrative in these countries, and it's not necessarily the case in developing countries. In Asia, the continent which will face the brunt of climate change due to its population density, the narrative has been restricted to coverage during calamities or major, environment summits. So my research not only draws attention toward current research in climate change coverage by the media, but it also critically examines the role played by media to shape the discourse for government and non-governmental organizations to set the agenda. And so therefore, this book that I have written appeals to media, climate change scholars, journalists, policymakers, and scientists to stop being mere spectators in this discourse, but become active producers in the creation of the news. And this could be through a role of a climate action warrior, thereby shaping media coverage towards more proactive narratives than that of doomsday voices. So I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll just talk a little bit about why it is important to, really focus on, these press narratives, and then I'll go through what the findings were, and then we can discuss about it later as well. So the purpose of writing this book is firstly to draw attention to the fact that reporting of climate change is not only a complex issue, but a significant one. Coverage of such matters, especially in press narratives, can have direct policy implications. I hear that many of you today in the audience are also scholars in the field of public administration policy, and so therefore I'd like to talk about this also a bit, that how it is important, because in this specific example of the Western Ghats being declared as an ecological sensitive area because of the UNESCO World Heritage Site tag, there was this policy issue. There was this problem of how to set the policy, and that policy started impacting so many stakeholders, and it is still a matter of contention, right? So therefore, how does the media's coverage of protests, of activism, how can it directly or indirectly show how political elites, policymakers, and local administration evaluate these protests and look at them either as success stories or either as something that needs to be thought about seriously, given serious consideration in order to think about maybe some tweaks here and there in the policy, or why this policy is not implemented, right? So this voice of the people can serve as an opinion when it reaches the government, when it reaches policy writers, when people are writing the IPCC report, so these can become strong messages through these channels of mainstream media and news media. And when I started my study, like in 2012, I looked at two mainstream media newspapers. Today, media is no longer confined to newspapers or channels. Anybody can become a digital journalist. Anybody can start their own blog, podcast, blog about climate change and sustainability, and they can become, a strong advocate towards these causes. So it's no longer confined to the mainstream media being the gatekeeper for this information. Secondly, since it has implications on policy matters, who is benefiting from this narrative and who is losing out is critical to examine here. Here, the onus is on media houses and journalists themselves to produce and disseminate facts to the key stakeholders in a very balanced and fair manner. And finally, it is interesting to analyze how climate change communication is dissected and decoded amongst these different stakeholders. And these different stakeholders are scientists who are working in pure theoretical science fields, the communities that are affected by climate change, the media, and the policymakers, and how all these stakeholders engage in this discourse. So the use of this media coverage of the Western Ghats, and as which I said in my introduction, as a macrocosm of climate change complexities, serves as an eye-opener to make sense of the vast and rich biodiversity that exists in India, and also to look at why this is significant and how is the media either underplaying or kind of highlighting the communication of this aspect of climate change, right? So let's go back to the slide where I left off with and look at what was the agenda set by the media here, how did they frame this issue, and what were the directions for thinking about public policy, and really what was it that came out through this analysis. So if you look at the state of media coverage and look at the analysis of global climate discourses, it's true that the media often covers issues related to climate change only during these specific instances. Number one, when the world leaders kind of get together for signing a treaty, like the COP summits, right? Like the COP summits, the Paris Agreement, the Copenhagen Summit, the Bonn Summit, and very recently COP26 at Glasgow. So these are big events where world leaders congregate, and these days COP summits are being attended by the industry, by business houses, by a variety of stakeholders, no longer by government agencies, but by a variety of stakeholders, because they are all, to be there in this discourse about climate change. So that causes a spike in coverage. Second aspect where the state of media coverage increases is when there is a disaster, and that disaster is related to a climate change event, like an extreme flooding event, or the sudden spate of forest fires, or an earthquake or a tsunami. So these kind of extreme weather events, which are attributed to, again, drastic changes in climate, disturbances, is when the media coverage peaks. So there is this constant battle that the media is also struggling to understand, and that again showcases how their editorial stance or policies are, is how much prominence to give to media, to climate change coverage. Should this news be on front page? Should we be constantly or continuously putting out information about media coverage of climate change? And so therefore, one aspect that the media also looks at is the public perception of, okay, if the public is, wanting to read, or the readers want to know more about this issue, they are interested, there is a heightened sense of activism amongst our readers, then maybe we need to understand that, if there is this public perception, then we need to map what the public or our readers know to what we know. And later in this discussion, I'll also show you how certain, in these two newspapers that I did a content analysis on, how one newspaper's contribution was only limited to news reports, while another newspaper's contribution was in-depth, analytical, because of these differences that they understood. Because they understood that their readers, that their target audience is not likely to go through detailed analytical essays, while the other newspaper realized that their target audience is interested only to get snippets in the form of maybe 250 to 300 word articles. So in understanding the public perception, the media also looks at what is their attitude towards climate change issues. Is it an attitude of adventure? Is it an attitude of just doing ecotourism, or is it an attitude for showing themselves as green warriors? So they kind of assess how their readers are showing an attitude towards climate change, and accordingly they cover issues in their pages based on that. For instance, they may showcase someone who's adopted a village and taken up the responsibility of agroforestry or apiculture there, or is training the communities there towards sustainable agricultural practices. So depending on that, then the newspaper chooses to have like a weekly feature or cover these kind of people who are involved in environmental aspects, through their through the way in which they kind of look at climate change and these issues. Then the other aspect is that of behavior. So the newspapers also are critically examining how their readers, what is the behavior that they exhibit. So in terms of are they conscious of their responsibility and role towards the climate. So are they having like weekly outings with their with younger children and taking them to kind of look after a neighborhood lake so that more winged visitors migrate to that lake, and then they start a bird watchers club or something like that. So how is their attitude having implications on their behavior, and how does this behavior reflect in the way in which the newspaper kind of projects a certain community, or how their behavior towards that is? Say for instance, there is this place near Bangalore where storks visit every year. They migrate there, and the local villagers adopt all these birds and they kind of look after them every year that they come there. And so most of the newspaper reporters will flock to that village just to cover these migratory birds and to show that relationship that the local community has with nature, right? So this is how behavior gets projected through newspaper coverage. Also influencing factors for a sustainable outlook, like for instance, how this community has banned the use of plastics, how this community has banned the use of plastics in weddings, how the weddings, which are large gatherings where people come and spend a lot of money, or they use a lot of plastic and disposable items, how a community of leaders said, let's not do this, let's have very eco-friendly weddings. So all these things, how they influence communities for having a sustainable outlook. So this is how the media chose to look at how their readers figured out climate change, and therefore they chose to communicate about it through these lenses. Now, why it's interesting to study media coverage of climate change is because we in Asia are going to be, facing the brunt of climate change, and scientists are studying this phenomenon quite a bit and trying to understand what is the reason that we have these specific weather conditions that makes us so dependent on our southwest monsoons, makes us so dependent on agriculture, which is a very rare phenomenon, right? I mean, and this is what a lot of physicists and climate scientists are trying to figure out, at how these wind patterns across the oceans affect the formation of clouds, how every year the southwest monsoon strikes the coast of Kerala on the 1st of June, and then we get copious amounts of rains which fill up our dams, our reservoirs, and sustains us till the next monsoon. But if climate change is happening at a very fast pace, then how we could be the worst affected, right? So there were these kind of, screaming headlines and projections of what can happen in terms of disasters and deaths that have happened from 98 to 2017 that the newspapers started to cover, okay? And, then they brought in different aspects of the ecosystem as well. Like, for instance, bees feel the sting of climate change. If the bees disappear, do we disappear as a human species? So posing these kind of questions, and then bringing in the judiciary to hold the government accountable, hold policymakers accountable for what policies they have set. So as I had, mentioned in my introduction, I can't play, this is a video, but because I converted it to PDF, I can't play it. So I went to this entire section of the Western Ghats and conducted, in addition to my analysis of the media's coverage of climate change, I also went to these pockets of communities that lived on the fringes of the forest. Initially, they were depending on the forest for their livelihoods. They would pick up the bark of trees and amla, wild amla, and all these are produced from the forest, and they would sustain themselves through picking up these things. But now, with the declaration of the Western Ghats as an ecological sensitive area, they could no longer go into the forests, and even if they have fought for it, and there is this Forest Right Act, which is where they are fighting for their rights to go into the forest. Even with that, they can go in but get out only a small amount of produce. So how these people are affected, what is their sense of climate change? So I went in there and conducted a series of focus group discussions, which is which is very difficult to do given that their education levels, their language, the way they perceive climate change is very different. The way they consume the media is very lopsided, and I'll talk about that as well later on. So conducting these focus group discussions for different groups in different sections of the Western Ghats brought out very interesting, aspects. For instance, there was this theme that emerged from one focus group discussion where they said, we used to go into the forest and pick products out of which we made broomsticks. We sold produce such as soapnut, dhoop, which is used in incense sticks, amla and honey. But with the implementation of the Forest Rights Act, we have a limit to the number of products we can pick from the forest. Also, we are regularly harassed by forest staff whenever we venture into the forest and false allegations are made. Also, one thing that the media is not looking at, and I talk about it in my book, is also that why can't the media use these local communities to report consistently about these change in weather patterns that are occurring? Why should, because one interesting aspect that came out of my discussions is when I asked these groups of, in my focus group discussion, when I asked these respondents that how do you perceive climate change? What do you understand by climate change? And their first response was, yes, we see it in television when there are copious amounts of rain falling in the main city, the capital of the state, and the traffic comes to a halt and everything comes to a halt and the roads are flooded. That is climate change. Now, imagine the irony of the situation. They are the ones closer to the ecosystem. They are the ones who should be giving us indicators about climate change. But because the media is feeding them with these images, because the agenda is already set that the media covers climate change only because the capital of the state or the capital of the nation is held to ransom because of a rare, climate change event. So the whole focus is taken away from the narrative that should be otherwise consistent. So I came up with these themes that I looked at from all these focus group discussions. So when I looked at, okay, how temperature precipitation is perceived by them, prolonged hot spells, erratic or sudden cloudbursts. But what are the response of the community? Health problems, and that's also part of my next study project, which is how climate change is going to have implications on health. And these vulnerable groups and communities are going to be, they're going to be those frontline people, like how in the defenses you have the infantry, which is like they are right at the front, safeguarding the battalions which are behind. It's these vulnerable groups of people who are there on the front line, and they are going to be facing the brunt of the health challenges, and they are going to be facing the brunt of socioeconomic problems because there is going to be changes in crop patterns. Then they're going to be migrating, and they're going to have a lot of hunger and poverty, and going to get into deep financial debt because of all these things that can happen. So these are some of the aspects that I discovered, and because of because I have to run through the rest of my presentation, I'll quickly move to the next slide. And so, like I discussed earlier, I looked at the database of 5-year coverage of Times of India and the Deccan Herald, and this is how the database looks like. And a few graphs that I'm trying to show and project here from the vast analysis that I've done is, how did the Times of India and Deccan Herald, so Times of India is depicted in the red and Deccan Herald in the blue because it's also identical to the logo of them on their masthead. So you can see that Deccan Herald has quite a number of, so this entire sample was about 550 reports. So you can imagine 5-year coverage, just 550 reports in total about climate change. that itself is a very stark number, right? And so you can see that in terms of news reports. So what we mean by news report is that just reporting, just not going in depth, just saying, okay, so and so thing happened, this person visited, this accident happened, this forest fire happened. So these are just news reports wherein something occurs and then the media writes about it. And the news reports itself were the chunk of the sample, which means that the media is not thinking through or not being analytical and not seeing the reason for them to project climate change in a very big manner. They are just happy to report about some events that happen which are connected to climate change. So the second aspect is a feature. Now, a feature article is quite a long article, at least 800 to 1,000 words. It discusses, it argues, it's very analytical, gives a lot of foresight. It's usually written by someone who's an expert in the field, and you can see the percentage of that quite less as well. Investigative pieces, again, very less in number. Analytical essays, not at all. Infographics, quite less, whereas actually a picture speaks 1,000 words, so there should be more infographics. Editorials, hardly any. Travel and adventure related, hardly any. Okay, so what we find is the same thing that I just mentioned, that Deccan Herald publishes a lot more news reports than Times of India. Analytical essays and infographics were given more attention in the Times of India because, and I talked about this earlier also, because the Times of India probably feels that their readers are more knowledgeable or they like to read essays and infographics. And compared to the Times of India, the Deccan Herald published articles related to travel and adventure, and feature and investigative pieces had a very proportionate ratio in both newspapers, indicating that both are publishing facts and regularly covering news related to this issue. Right. So again, when we look at, so this is again an example of an infographic, how it looked like. So I mentioned that the Times of India published more infographics than Deccan Herald. So you can see that an infographic is very, very informative. People like to read such things in today's time and age where we have we struggle to gain attention of our readers. So it's a good trend if newspapers are media starts projecting it more in the form of these infographics. This is something that I picked up from Twitter because I'm very active on Twitter, and a lot of climate change, interesting insights can be gained from different people who, use their Twitter accounts. So one thing that I noticed on Twitter is that there are a lot of interesting infographics, whether this is the one on the left by News 18 Graphics, or you get interactive infographics which move, where you have heat maps, you can actually track things, you can feel it. It's all about making the user feel climate change through the way in which the graphs move. Like 10 years from now, how will the heat be in this city? How will the rainfall pattern be? So the readers are interested to use interactive graphics like this, and the media is also looking to give out some things like that. So why it's interesting to use the media's coverage to assess climate change, it's also because select use of attributes can affect the evaluation of an issue. For instance, what is the relevance of the media coverage, the policy imbroglio that is currently plaguing the Western Ghats? So how we can investigate the framing of climate change and policy relevant decisions, and what were the frames that were identified, right? So if we look at all this, one thing that we have to reckon with is that media coverage matters, and because journalists, editors, and media owners have a very critical role to play in this narrative, that the role of the media must shift from disaster narrative to developing solutions, that journalists are faced with challenges from a range of actors on the field, in the corridors of power, and in their own establishments, and that the media can demonstrate a key role in shaping the discourse of climate change through communicating frequently upon public perception and policy agenda, and they can invest in specialized coverage at the intersection of climate change, environmental policy, and law to focus on covering the politics and policy of climate change to help decision makers distill climate and environmental policy issues. So So again, a broad overview of the sample that I collected for my study. And you can look at the peaks, which I talked about. So the peaks in coverage are because of the fact that the Paris summit was taking place then, because of the fact that that was when the UNESCO decided to tag the Western Ghats as a World Heritage Site. So, my argument is that the peaks should not happen only when there are these situations, only when the situations are newsworthy, but the consistency should continue, that there should not be peaks and, there should not be a fall in newspaper coverage about about climate change, that it should continue. But that is also reflected not only in India, it's not only in my study, it's also reflected in other worldwide studies where they tracked newspaper coverage for global warming, as they called it at that time. And you can see that those peaks again there are during the COP summits. So coming to my last 2 slides, and we need to talk about concerted climate action. We need to do these 3 things, and that's what I've been talking about in all the talks that I've been giving. That is, we need to first build the next generation of climate leaders. So there is this concept of eco-grief that is hounding our young leaders, and they're talking about, okay, you all have already handed us a planet which is in so much of distress. What do we do now? And they're just putting their hands up. So we can't afford to let our youngsters feel that eco-grief. We can't let it get to them. We have to build the next generation of leaders, whether it is through passing down the information that we have collected. We've done so much of work. Every different stream, every domain has done so much in terms of understanding what has been happening. We must pass that down to the next generation so that they bring their own insights while using the body of work that has been accumulated. Secondly, we need to become publicly engaged scholars. So we should come out of the silos that we are working within. This is a highly multidisciplinary field. We must engage with other fields and contribute to policy, contribute to key action reports, interact with businesses, social scientists, climate scientists, instead of working in silos. And third, we should be proactive in networking when there is an upcoming summit, release of an IPCC report, relevant forums that align the discussion to that of your country's persistent messaging. We have to become more proactive there, right? And we also need to, because I'm talking to young scholars who are into public administration and public policy, we need to also build policy instruments, become engaged by doing this with the different stakeholders, because you can see in the situation that I just narrated how it was so important for them to engage with different stakeholders so that the policy imbroglio that is currently plaguing the Western Ghats would not have reached that situation that it has reached right now, and be the change that you want to see. So you can also see how businesses respond to climate change. So there are these key words that keep coming up, whether it was net zero, carbon neutral that the EU is talking about, carbon pricing. So all these are words, they are there, but you have to think about why the businesses or organizations are responding to climate change in this way. Does it also show that the media is talking about it in this sense, or is it also the agenda setting that's happening at the background that we need to look at? So I'll just run you through the comments that I've got for my book. So one was, from Ricky Cage. He's a 2-time Grammy Award winner. He says that this book is accessible. It provides balanced and informed analysis of India's environmental governance, focusing on managing the impacts of development while staring at a biodiversity crisis, and a much needed positive tone in a lucid manner. The reader gains a deep and rich insight on the conundrum that the media faces while mediating. And that's really what's happening here, that the media is in a way mediating between policymakers, environmentalists, because the nature of climate change itself is very multidimensional and complex. And so they are actually mediating in this whole process. And there's a scholar, Professor Andrew Hoffman. He's at the University of Michigan School of the Ross School of Business, and he says that he looks at this as a hottest hotspot of biological diversity, and how it is a very unique space, the Western Ghats, to look at it. So so these are the other mentions of my book. The Indian edition will release this month end. Please do look it up. It will be available on Amazon. Lastly, media narratives can shape the outcome of the discourse about climate change. What we need to do is we need to connect the dots. We need to see how science plus policy adds up and gives us an informed public who want to move towards climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ganapathy, for that very, very detailed and very engaging talk. I open the floor to questions, and I would request everyone to, if you could, use the raise hand feature, we could, go in an orderly fashion. And in the meanwhile, Dr. Ganapathy, I think that there are some messages here. You may want to respond to that.
Yeah, I'm just going through that. So Sarika is saying it's interesting to find India compatible in that Twitter infographic. Very effective presentation, politics of inclusion. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Sarika.
Okay, so while we have questions coming in, I was just wondering. We know that there are a lot of public, and this is a kind of a general question, but a lot of public personalities, people who have a lot of influence, go on record and deny climate change. How would you, as a researcher, how do you respond to that, or what do you think is the media responsibility there, or how has the media, if it has responded to it, how have they done it, or what is their role in it?
Okay, so this situation is also quite prevalent in developed economies. So if you see in the Western countries, the narrative for this climate denial is very much influenced by political affiliation, right, left, the religion that one belongs to. So it becomes a very controversial aspect as well, because if your religious body is telling you don't agree, this is not what our scriptures are telling, or this is not what our religious sermons believe, then it's also likely to open up a whole Pandora's box for discussion. So therefore the media must very critically examine this, and if for instance, in today's day and age, like you rightly said, personalities can directly broadcast, right? They directly can talk to large amounts of their followers without the media intervening there, or without the media being the gatekeeper there. And, then they can influence a whole bunch of people. And therefore, it's very important also for people who are doing it in a scientific way to also come out on these platforms and start speaking, because that's when the debate becomes very interesting. And we can see that in the last 2 years with the pandemic as well, when people were were against the vaccine or not wanting to get vaccinated, most of the medical fraternity, they came out on Twitter. They had their own personal handles, and they would give very evidence-based, case-based discussions, and they started garnering a huge following as well. A lot of us started following medical practitioners from different parts of the world to see what were the projections, how the first wave was in that country, how the second wave was here, what were the trends they were showing. So if there is this huge narrative that is sparking off this debate, then the scientific community should also, and that's what I'm talking about all the time, that they should also engage publicly, because it's no longer now relevant to sit and publish and let the journal speak for itself, but you also have to make it relevant to the general audience, and you have to also make it relevant to policy. For that, you have to, put it there down in lay terms. But on the other hand, we are seeing another extreme where a lot of scientists were recently, they were trying to make their governments in the Western world understand that the implications for climate change are real, and they went and they were, protesting on the streets, and there was that extreme situation as well, because they feel that they are not being heard enough. So, when the more communication channels and tools are available, then one must make use of that, especially that, when you can see that the broadcast is not happening in a very unbiased way, then it's necessary for more and more people to come out there and add to the conversation, add to the deliberation, so that it becomes a healthy and meaningful debate rather than a lopsided argument. That's what I feel very strongly.
Thank you, Dr. Ganapathy. I think we have some questions here in the chat box. And the first one says, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering whether your research has been able to study how perhaps discourses of development are reconciled with climate consciousness as well in media today in India. This is by Niti Alexander.
Yeah, so the question is how perhaps discourses of development are reconciled with climate consciousness. Yeah, so that is where the media is mediating, because on one hand there is this the way in which today media ownership patterns are changing, right? Media ownership patterns are now mostly driven by who owns them and which corporate entity is owning them. So again, that has an influence on the way in which their editorial stances, whether it is pro-establishment, anti-establishment, whether it is towards development issues, whether it is towards, helping businesses grow. So all these factors must be taken into account. Therefore, when one reads the newspaper, one is reading these kind of news messages, consistency, one should also be aware that these factors are at play at the background. And therefore, these are influencing the way in which, the media is going to cover it, right? And so this aspect of climate consciousness that you're talking about today, most of the media houses are coming out with specialized environmental reporting, whether it is on a Sunday, in the Sunday edition, or, whether it is on a regular basis. But when I started my study, that was hardly the case. It was just, you saw the percentages, how minuscule they were. But today there is that, conscious effort to bring out some kind of a reporting that aligns to climate change, that aligns to this environmental consciousness. And we can see that quite a bit, but that's not enough. It has to be more consistent, and it has to be more action-oriented, solution-oriented, rather than a doomsday narrative. It has to, say, for instance, when the media keeps covering issues of how people are coping with climate change, how they are coming up with alternative sustainable practices, how there is a change in behavior, change in attitude, that will trickle down to the entire population in a slow but measured manner. So the more the media starts focusing on these, solution-oriented approaches and starts showcasing real people like you and me who are, involved in some cause, who are involved in showing that these are ways in which one can move forward, it will also mean that the rest of, the readers will get influenced, motivated to think differently about the issue. So that is very important here.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ganapathy, for that wonderful talk and very, very engaging presentation. We will now move on to our next presenter for today's session, and I would request Dr. Tanya Chakravarti to take over here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ganapathy, for the presentation. It was a very stimulating and wonderful presentation. And thank you, Dr. Ghoshal, for your time and your wonderful hosting. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanka, Tanya, and Nilanjana. Wonderful. And all the participants, I can see are around 80 to 90 participants. Thank you so much. And I hope you can go back thinking about this issue in a different way and read, through the media reports now with a better understanding after this talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you.